Hi everyone. So today I'm going to be talking about affirmative action, and it's especially relevant because of the Supreme Court decision in June, and also because it concerns college admissions and education, which of course all of us participate in. The discussion we're to have today will examine the history behind affirmative action. We'll talk about common arguments for and against affirmative action, and then also just discuss opinions and share thoughts about it. Just a little bit about me and why this is relevant. So this summer I did a little bit of work in terms of researching and doing journalism about affirmative action, student protesters at colleges, things of that nature, analyzing the history of affirmative action, gathering high school and college student opinions about the Supreme Court decision. So I was pretty involved in it in terms of the journalism aspect. Here I've provided links, and this slideshow will be in the description of the video and also the Google Classroom. So if you guys wish to access anything, it's there for you. So why discuss affirmative action? As I'd already mentioned, it's very relevant to students with the Supreme Court decision. It's kind of been the source of a mini culture war, if you will, about race and education, and as a result, it's very heavily misunderstood and argued about unproductively in a way that doesn't really account for all of the important perspectives and there's just a lot of bad disagreement there. So therefore, discussing education and topics like these are very, very important to make sure that we have an equitable admission system. All right, so in terms of affirmative action's power in influencing educational and employment opportunities, fluctuated throughout the years because there's been many policy legislation that has really affected it. So I created a timeline with the history of affirmative action, and we're just going to briefly go through it. This is actually linked in the article, and yeah, we'll just start from the beginning then. So, in 1961, in 1961, President John F. Kennedy signed Executive Order 10925, which is credited as the first use case of affirmative action in governmental employment opportunities. So this created the President's Committee on Equal Employment Opportunity and mandated affirmative action to ensure that applicants are employed and that they aren't treated in discriminatory ways. And yeah, it just gave a lot more power to the federal government to really be able to lead into affirmative action as a method of employment. Continuing on, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, drafted in 1962, I suppose, the U.S. Congress passed it, which prohibited employment discrimination on the basis of race, color, religion, sex, and national origin. And this codified the protection of employees and prevented employer retaliation and discrimination against workers or against prospective employees in the hiring process. Another executive order was passed by President Johnson, succeeding Kennedy's executive order, by expanding affirmative action policies to all federal and construction contractors. So this really just expanded it beyond employment into other aspects of employment as well. And then the first use case, or the first real, large case of affirmative action in terms of college admissions happened with Regents of the University of California versus Bakke. So here's a description of Alan Bakke, who claimed that there was a violation of the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment, to which the Supreme Court favored Bakke, ruling that racial quotas within affirmative action programs are unconstitutional. In other words, there is a difference between racial quotas, saying that we need a minimum of X amount of individuals of a particular class or ethnicity or race, versus affirmative action policies, which generally regard race as a factor among a myriad of factors in the college admissions process. Today, colleges and people in general refer to this as holistic review. In 1996, California banned affirmative action through Proposition 209 in a 55 to 45% split, passing the law. Affirmative action programs for all educational institutions, contracting agencies with the government, and public workplaces were banned. This took effect in 1998, and we'll talk about a stat that I'll introduce later in the presentation as to how this affected the enrollment of different minorities. In 2003, Grutter versus Bollinger was another major Supreme Court case, and this was a major victory for affirmative action. It ruled that affirmative action policies can consider race along with a myriad of factors in determining admission. So Grutter was the person who claimed to have been rejected from the school on the basis of her race. despite her LSAT and GPA being higher than most other minority students. And Bollinger was the then president of the University of Michigan. He then moved to Columbia, and he actually retired recently. And he is a pretty outspoken advocate of affirmative action. In 2016, this major Supreme Court case, Fisher versus Texas, happened, where Abigail Fisher, an applicant to UT Austin, was rejected and did not qualify for auto admission. She was in 12%, so the UT system works that the top 10% of the class at your high school gets auto admission to the UT system. She was in the 12th percentile. So the 4-3 Supreme Court decision in favor of UT upheld decisions made by lower courts that race could be a consideration among the numerous other factors in the interest of promoting racial diversity among the student population. In other words, another huge victory for affirmative action. And this case was led by a conservative activist named Edward Blue, who represents and is the main leader of the Students for Fair Admissions organization, which is the primary plaintiffs. They represent the Asian American plaintiffs in the they represent plaintiffs of Asian American applicants who were rejected from UNC Chapel Hill and Harvard College. So the 6-2 Supreme Court decision was ruling in favor of the plaintiffs. SFFA reversed the lower court ruling and held that race-conscious admission processes were in violation of the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. So this was really a pivotal, decision that made it such that colleges had to very rapidly adapt and change their policies to no longer be able to account for race as a factor in admission. There is just a couple of nice articles. So that's the timeline in terms of just major events. Of course, there are many intermediary court cases in between. By no means is this exhaustive, but it does kind of just outline the fluctuations of affirmative action, how it's been strengthened, how it's been incorporated in educational employment opportunities, and then how it's been broken down. It's super important. Specifically for the SFFA versus Harvard and UNC cases, a suit with anonymous Asian plaintiffs opened up in November 2014. In May 2015, over 60 Asian American organizations sued the Department of Education and Department of Justice. From 2015 to 2019, the general public gets information and access to a lot of unsealed, or then sealed documents about, just how exactly colleges like Harvard actually admit students, which we'll also talk about. And then the 6-2 decision in favor of the SFFA over Harvard made it such that affirmative action is unconstitutional. So I think at this point, it is just very, very important to talk about why college is so important. So without a doubt, the thing about college is that it is easily one of the most, critical methods to break out of intergenerational poverty. The New York Times study found that people from low-income backgrounds who complete college, compared to those who only complete high school degrees, increase their career earnings by 71%. That, along with employment and home ownership, are important catalysts for breaking out of the cycle of intergenerational poverty that has gripped especially many minorities and different social classes in America. But something important to note is that the reason why there's such heavy focus on these elite institutions is because they're the ones that more often than not are implementing affirmative action policies, also known as race-conscious admissions. Here are a couple of interesting stats. So Ivy League grads are favored for State Department promotions. 10% of Congress attended an Ivy League institution for their bachelor's degree. Students who attended Yale, Princeton, or Harvard for undergrad are heavily favored in securing Supreme Court justice clerkships even after law school. And all of this is to say that most of the leaders in America, socially, politically, judicially, are controlled by people who attend Ivy League institutions. That is why it's especially relevant, and this is why talking about race-conscious admissions is so important, because historically it has always been African American and Hispanic and Latinx students who have been discriminated against and that have been most disadvantaged in the process for applying to elite institutions. And the major concern that many Asian Americans and white applicants hold is that they are disadvantaged in the process. We'll talk more about it in a second. But of course, this isn't a very black and white issue. There are gray areas. So there are a couple of key things that I think are worth talking about because these are a couple of facts that I don't really think are very often discussed. So for one thing, the ruling doesn't actually place restrictions on students writing about their race or identity. So 55 plus colleges, including Harvard and Cornell, for example, updated their prompts after the decision to give students an opportunity to write and reflect on their background in their supplemental essays, for example. Harvard replacing their one long supplemental essay with 5 short ones, 200 words each. It really just shows how colleges had to adapt because of the Supreme Court decision. Number 2, it is unclear whether or not Grutter versus Bollinger in 2003, the Supreme Court case that greenlighted the use of affirmative action in college admissions, was ever actually overturned. Some justices back in 2003, like Kavanaugh or Sandra Day O'Connor, stated that they expected affirmative action to be largely a temporary, kind of component of the college admissions process. And it's interesting because now there is a lot of disagreement because Day O'Connor and another one of her colleagues, Hagan, actually were part of the two that voted against the SFSA. So yeah. Here is a clause of the actual opinion that was released officially by the Supreme Court. So yeah. Now, I think we need to address the elephant that's in the room, or not in the room, about legacy. The affirmative action debate brought to the fore important conversations about the subjectiveness of holistic review in ALDCs. ALDCs being athletes, legacies, dean's interest lists, and children of faculty and staff. So the SFFA versus Harvard ruling, unsealed insight about how Harvard determines admits. The first step is recruitment. More often than not, a lot of these athletes or recruits for other things get recruited through restrictive early action, and then alumni interviews occur after applications are submitted, and then there are application read-throughs by admissions officers. There is found to be different categories that, for example, Harvard ranks students by. So there's academic, extracurricular, athletic, and personal categories on a scale of 1 to 6, 1 being the highest, 6 being the lowest. And yeah, it's very interesting because for some of these categories, it is very, very objective. For example, 75% of students, about the last time I checked the common data sets from Harvard, it showed that 75% of students had a 4.0. 21%, around 21% had a 3.75 to 3.99, and then everything else below that. Extracurricular, rather subjective. Athletic, rather objective because of records. And then personal categories, extremely subjective. Here, SFFA claimed that Asian Americans were more often than not discriminated in the personal category compared to other peers of different race or of different social classes. And finally, there's committee votes and final decisions. New professor Peter Arcidiacono, also an SFFA consultant for the Supreme Court case, found how many white students percentage-wise were of ALDC status. Does anyone want to take a guess? Yeah. 43%. How do you know that? Yes, 43%. 43% of white admits at Harvard have ALDC status. So yeah, very, very large in terms of the percentage of white admits and white students at Harvard that have benefited from ALDC status. A few more notes of nuance. The ruling excludes military academies, allowing them to continue practicing affirmative action. Chief Justice Roberts claimed there to be a potentially distinct interest in retaining affirmative action, and 35 former high-ranking military officials filed in front of the court amicus briefs arguing that affirmative action is important for national security. It brings to question whether or not affirmative action, why do we draw the line with military academies? A lot of heavy scrutiny, especially from the dissenting justices. So yeah, and then also we of course need to acknowledge the harmful narratives surrounding the perceived effect of affirmative action, which leads to increased self-rejection of Asian identity. Now, in many interviews that I've had with college students, they've reflected on the countless experiences being told that you shouldn't check off that you're Asian in the application because it'll disadvantage you. And then there are others who disagreed and found it very important to make sure their identity was known, even if it came to a disadvantage for them. And a APA study found that the fear of self-identifying as Asian can affect one's racial and ethnic identity development and have an impact on one's mental health. A lot of comprehensive and definitive studies proving, emotional conflicts or psychological effects of this type of conflict, including emotional distance between parents and children, interpersonal problems, lack of self-confidence and assertiveness, high suicidal risk, and anxiety and depression. So now for common arguments for and against affirmative action. So, of course, there are claims that affirmative action is important for minorities who experience structural discrimination and oppression, namely African Americans and Hispanic and Latinx. And then on the other end, there's just the idea that affirmative action may disadvantage white and Asian students writ large in terms of admission, and also that it may disadvantage white and Asian students of lower income and socioeconomic background. The same professor that I mentioned earlier, who's a consultant for SFFA, found that Harvard admits more than twice as many non-disadvantaged African American applicants than disadvantaged African American applicants. So it's very interesting because it shows a lack of distinction between things along income or income lines for as an actual factor for affirmative action, and it's more so exclusively just centered around race. Another argument for affirmative action that is important for diversifying student populations. Now, without it, admissions would have no incentive to do so. So we talked about UC versus UC Regents versus Bakke, and it was found in Proposition 209, which passed in 1996. That proposition went into effect for the class of 1998. And when the UC system banned affirmative action, enrollment among Black and Latino students at UCLA and UC Berkeley for the class of 1998 fell by 40%. So it is proven to have a very, very drastic downturn impact for these minorities as a result of anti-affirmative action stances. And another very, very important thing to consider is that supporting or not supporting affirmative action is what it's this isn't a black or white issue. And there is this interesting principle-practical disconnect. So most people support the idea of equalizing and diversifying student population because it has positive impacts and benefits on more intellectual spaces. And more than 70% of the AAPI community actually recognize the existence of systemic racism. The divergence lies in the practical. How do we go about promoting equity of opportunity in college admissions? This is where the disagreement occurs, and we have a tendency to hold well-spirited and imperfectly implemented policy. So, the disconnect in motion. 53% of Asian adults support the concept of affirmative action, but when asked about the list of factors that colleges should consider, only 21% of Asian adults say that colleges should consider race and ethnicity when deciding which students to accept. So there's a very, very clear disconnect between wanting to promote equity of opportunity and not supporting affirmative action as a result. Of course, affirmative action is one mechanism instrument in the toolkit of diversity promoting factors for colleges, and this is the primary dilemma that many Asian Americans are in. On one hand, supporting a system that recognizes the fact that there have been centuries of systematic oppression and disenfranchisement through societal institutions, but also having the incentive to not want to hurt your own admissions chances. This is where there's a very, very large dilemma that we need to reconcile as a society. And the exclusion of this very, very nuanced disconnect between the principle and the practical in conversations about affirmative action enable the media to push upon us two characterizations of people. First, the idea that on one side you have people who believe in color blindness and are against affirmative action, and then on the other, people who believe that the existence of systemic racism, and are for affirmative action, but who often focus on the principle much more than the practical, and in some cases act that the principle is all there is to worry about. So pushing only two options or two kind of perceptions about where people fall into in terms of the discussion and stance on affirmative action, it is very, very reductive in the sense that there is this principle practical split that we talked about. We need to be increasingly more supportive of being accepting of things that promote diversity, but at the same time, even if it might be at the detriment for our own admissions chances. All right. So at this time, are there any remarks or questions about anything that we've discussed so far? Just really anything about Yes. Yeah, absolutely. For the UC class of 1998 with a 40% drop, that happened in a very, very small, very narrow, time frame, because Proposition 209 was 1996, and within 2 years there was already such a drastic drop. So honestly, it's really hard to say because many colleges are aware about the fact that happened to the UC, UCLA, UC Berkeley, And for one thing, they do have a reputation to maintain. They have their bottom line. They need to make sure that they have diverse populations, and it's honestly hard to say whether or not there's going to be a similar effect. But if people overwhelmingly decide to write about their identity and race in their applications, I think in that way they can definitely promote diversity. But at the same time, there is a very, very large, sense of apprehensiveness about writing about your identity because you don't want to be, disadvantaged as a white or Asian applicant. So it very much varies because some people are very open to writing about like their identity. Like I made it a point, my interview with the Crimson, I made it a point to emphasize that I wanted to, mention my race and identity because I find it important to my story, and contextualizing my background. But others might not feel the same way. So very hard to say. I guess we'll have to look at, how that turned out in a few years. Any other remarks or statements or questions? Yeah. 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 I mean, there was exceptionally low admission of Hispanic, and there will be exceptionally low admission of Hispanic or Latinx and African American if not for affirmative action. And this whole affirmative action discussion, of course, is not to say that that Asians didn't undergo structural oppression, because let's be clear, we did, right? But what this entire discussion really boils down to is recognizing that we shouldn't be weighing between different pieces of oppression, like different policies, because at the end of the day, our goal should be to equalize opportunity for admission into elite universities, which are proven to have a host of benefits for everyone. And even if that comes to the detriment of a few of us, at the end of the day, we'll reach a point where diversity will be so widespread across many of these elite institutions where it won't be necessary anymore. So that is the hope of the Supreme Court justices, and hopefully that's what we're headed for. Yeah.
Talk about how minority myth kind of also plays into the fact that people think like since Asian Americans make higher income than Black Americans or Hispanic Americans, like how that also affects like affirmative action,
Yeah, I mean, the model minority myth has a very, very strong link to this, to like this discussion, because in many ways, the wrong argument that is being made by some, in favor of affirmative action, is claiming that Asians are more privileged inherently, that we are the more well-off minority, when in many cases that can be factually untrue. That does not account for, many, many underrepresented, East Asians, for example. And just in general, the model minority myth is especially at play here because the commonality between the whole affirmative action culture war and the model minority myth is that they're essentially pitting minorities against each other, right? The idea that we shouldn't have to like make a decision as to whether or not we want to support our own interests in college admissions at the expense of others, because we just see it as unfair when in reality, without affirmative action, in my opinion, of course, many may disagree. Without affirmative action, we wouldn't be able to, support other minorities as well. So I think it is a shared collective responsibility of all minorities to look out and care for each other beyond their own self-interest to get into particular institutions. Because another very important thing to realize is that affirmative action in the consideration of race is merely one factor among many. It is not the deciding factor as to whether or not you get into a particular institution. And many people have are under the preconception that this is like the margin. This is like the difference between me getting into Harvard or me not getting into Harvard. And that is in many ways reductive of just the complete like complexity and arbitrariness of the college admissions process. Yeah, it's really just interconnected with the debate.
since you were talking about what was it like the ADC, ALDC,
Yes.
like ALDC, how you were saying a large percentage of people in like the Supreme Court and like U.S. government did come from these elite institutions,
Exactly.
and they were the ones who do they benefit from affirmative action, or is that a myth?
Can you repeat your question?
So like, since they're the ones, I mean, like, if the people in the Supreme Court are like ruling against affirmative action,
Yes.
but if they, is that because like they believe? Is it possible that it's because like they believe that they're like not benefiting from
I think
affirmative
there's
action?
potential. I think the strongest argument that the judges or the justices in the majority said was that this was in violation of the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. So just like interpreting it from the law, but there is potential for like very implicit bias to against such systems because of the potential disadvantage it might render to like white applicants and Asian applicants. It's very possible. Um, Actually, Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson had to recuse herself from the Harvard case because she is on the Harvard Board of Overseers. Um, so usually conflicts of interest like those, like outright conflicts of interest, usually are like frowned upon, and justices usually recuse themselves from it. But there's potential for that, for sure. Yeah. So as we're nearing the end, I think that's pretty much everything. So thank you so much.